G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, I'm going through my first team selection of the season for the Australian Grand Prix. So if you're new around here, you're enjoying this F1 fantasy content, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. We will jump straight into my preseason notes and some considerations I've thought about when structuring my first F1 fantasy lineup for this season. I've had a couple of videos out already around my first drafts and initial reactions to the game going live, which should also provide a bit more color to what we're talking about here. So check those out if you haven't done so already, but did want to just digest some of the key talking points that are factoring into my decision-making process right now. First thing I want to cover off is just how good McLaren looked in preseason testing in Bahrain. They were objectively the strongest car. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri both looked really good over a single lap and long run pace. And I think there should be, for most F1 fantasy strategists, an element of considering McLaren, whether it's through one of the drivers or a constructor for their fantasy teams this season. I think there is certainly merit to going for a more budget building or more balanced approach to a certain degree, but you can still certainly do that with McLaren assets. And I think either if it is an Oscar Piastri and two premium constructors, whether it's a combination of Red Bull, Mercedes or Ferrari, or you're going a Lando Norris McLaren constructor or just the McLaren constructor, I think there's certainly different ways to structure your team, but making sure you're also covering off McLaren and their fantasy production from the outset. And I think that's just a really good indication of what to expect in terms of reliability and fantasy performance this season. I think what's also really encouraging to me is the fact that McLaren last year were the most consistent constructor on the grid in terms of DNFs. Both drivers, in fact, for that matter. Oscar Piastri completed every single Grand Prix lap last year. Lando Norris did too, with the exception of obviously the sprint race retirement in Miami and then obviously coming to blows with Max in Austria. So the fact that the constructor itself had every driver classified in every Grand Prix session, I think is a really good sign of confidence and kind of fantasy performance that you want from a really good asset in McLaren. In terms of kind of discussing consistency and reliability, the DNF penalty of -20 has stood in F1 Fantasy for 2025. There was a lot of discussion around that in the community last year as to whether it was too harsh. I myself got burnt by, I think it was 26 disqualifications and DNFs in 2024. And, there's obviously a large degree of luck that goes into that, but also making sure, and I think that's going to be a bigger part of my thought process this year, is choosing reliable, consistent drivers to not just limit the number of -20s you get hit with every single week, but also contribute to managing that consistent budget gain each week as well. Given the new pricing model in place, there are going to be more extreme budget swings. And I think as a result of that, having those reliable drivers to, if not build budget more consistently, limit the number of price drops based on the new symmetrical pricing system in the B tier, where, as you can see, terrible performances can contribute to a $0.6 million price drop. I guess the other side of the coin to that is if you can nail reliable and consistent drivers, particularly in the B tier where there is much more room to grow, those gains can be massive. I'm looking at Williams, I'm looking at Alpine, maybe even Kimi Antonelli or Liam Lawson as high risk, high reward assets that could very much, if they perform well early doors, really contribute to early budget growth. Now, I will say we're not going to see the same extreme gains that we saw in other assets last year, where C-tier assets were going up 1 or 1.5 million or even 0.5 million on a consistent basis. But I think if you've got assets positioned to at least score reliably, it will set you up later in the season for a much more well-rounded and consistent team. So I think I really like that element of approaching the game and your team selection with a lens to consistency and reliability from the early goings in the game. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, which I'm sure you're all here for, is my first team selection for 2025. And I think I've got to start at the top with Oscar Piastri. I will say this team is subject to change before the deadline, but kind of where my head is at right now based on what we've seen and the prices in the game, Oscar at 23 million is for me someone who I've really had my eye on from even before preseason testing. If you go back to some of my first videos on the channel for this year, I've been very, you know, glowing in praise of Oscar, and I think he's a kind of driver that at 23 is going to deliver a consistent baseline of points for your fantasy teams week to week. He's coming off a season in 2024 where he had double-digit fantasy scores in every single race last year, finished every single lap, won 2 races, and obviously contributed to McLaren's surge to winning the Constructors' Championship. So I think at 23 million, for me, becomes a very obvious pick if I choose not to go down the McLaren route. Someone who I would almost consider an automatic lock in my team for the first race of the season. I just love what I'm seeing from Oscar. He's in contention for a podium. I would say, if not the win on home soil, coming off a contract extension. There's just a lot of good signs pointing towards a good result for the Aussie in Australia. So I'm going to be rooting for him at the track this weekend and really hoping he can turn in a performance for the ages in front of the home crowd. Further down the order, we've got Esteban Ocon at 7.3. I love Ocon's consistency and reliability. Last year, he was one of the best scoring drivers under 15 million and had the second highest price gain among all assets behind only Kevin Magnussen, who a former Haas driver as well. I think another good form, a good sign, I should say, for someone stepping into this seat. Now, Ocon, he has had in the past, issues of having like rash temperament, teammate killer kind of vibes, or not killer, but, teammate issues. I don't think that's going to be as much of a problem this season, and I think at 7.3 comes in at a very good price. I would say even underpriced by maybe $1 million or $2 million. I think for him and Ollie Behrman, who I've also got on the screen here at 6.7, Haas can take a lot of confidence from their preseason testing program in Bahrain. We saw this 12 months ago where Ayo Komatsu came in to right the ship. Haas were looking like an absolute mess, and they just stuck to their own program, hit the ground running from the first race of the season, and both drivers in Haas, in Magnussen and Hülkenberg last year, became exceptionally good fantasy assets in the midfield to build budget and score points on a reliable and consistent basis. I'm expecting that from both Haas drivers this time around. And although Ollie Behrman is a rookie, and I'll talk about these rookies on screen here in just a minute, he does have that reliability and consistency that we've seen from him in the 3 races he's been in Formula One last year. He had 1 with Ferrari and 2 with Haas. Points finishes in Saudi Arabia and Baku, 2 of the most difficult tracks on the calendar, and then back that up with a P12 in Brazil. But given how treacherous those conditions were, and that, a quarter of the grid DNF that race weekend, I can take a lot of confidence from that drive from Ollie Behrman. It's going to be wet in Melbourne this weekend, so that kind of consistency is something I really want to be seeing from him. On to Isaac Hadjar. Now, probably one of the lesser known commodities in F1 and Formula One fantasy, but at 6.2 becomes a very good budget enabler. Hadjar actually had the most wins in Formula 2 in 2024, and he also won at Albert Park last year. So I think that's a really good sign for a driver that we don't know all that much about. He was also runner-up in F2 to Gabriel Bortoleto, who we also have in the team at the moment. And I think being in an RB that'll probably start a little bit further towards the back does set himself up for a few positions, gain, overtakes, etc., if there is any kind of chaos or carnage we see at Albert Park this weekend in the wet weather. Now, speaking of a driver that is reliable, I want to talk about Gabriel Bortoleto. Bortoleto is the back-to-back F2 and F3 winner the last 2 years and made a reputation for himself in F2 last year as a driver that was extremely reliable, wasn't putting the car on the wall, was just getting it to the end of the race. And even though he didn't have as many wins as Hadjar's in Formula 2 last year, he only had 2 DNFs among all drivers that completed 18 or more races, the most in that kind of grouping of drivers in Formula 2. And I think that reputation, that consistency and reliability is a really good sign of things to come. He's going to be in a Sauber. The Sauber is going to be at the very back. We saw how terrible that tractor was last year. I think, again, like Hadjar, if he's qualifying quite further back, he's out in Q1, it sets himself up nicely for positions gained and overtakes. And then in terms of Ferrari and Mercedes, Ferrari, for me, a team that I think with one of the most experienced driver pairings on the grid in Hamilton and Leclerc, really liking what I'm seeing from these guys. Again, I feel like they were a little hard to read in preseason testing, to be completely honest with you. But the fact that, and I take this as a good omen, for the last 10 years, either Leclerc or Hamilton has finished on the podium in Albert Park, suggests to me that that streak's likely to continue this time around. And I do think that even though they may not have grabbed as many headlines as McLaren, and it's still a bit of a toss-up between Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull in that kind of second slot, or that second place in the constructors. I do think that there is a lot of upside, and in these wet weather conditions, something that I think will bode very well for the Scuderia. So I'm really liking that. One other thing I will also say is that Ferrari averaged the third most number of pit stops per race at 3.2 points per race last season, just behind McLaren at 3.6. So they are kind of a budget alternative in the pit stop department for I guess that point scoring metric, if that's what you're looking for. And then in terms of Mercedes, a team again that kind of just rounds out this lineup quite nicely. I do think there is certainly something to be said about not just George Russell, but Mercedes as a whole in 2024, where they were really good in the cold weather conditions. And I think that's given on the forecast for this weekend, where it is going to be very warm on Saturday and then cool down on Sunday. We may see George Russell and Kimi qualify between P5 and P8 and then make up a few positions and overtakes on the race day to set that constructor up for a nice haul of points. So that's kind of where my team selection is at right now. I'll come over to the F1 Fantasy website and show you kind of where my team is at right now. At the moment, you can see there is nothing on the screen here, so I'll do my best to populate the team from what I've just talked through. But I think the reason why I'm starting with a double Haas lineup, Isaac Hadjar, Gabriel Bortoleto, and Oscar Piastri and Esteban Ocon, I should say, is simply because of the flexibility that having this kind of lineup provides for the second race of the season. So this is what my team is currently. And what I like about it is that I have 1 million left. I could easily bring in Gabriel Bortoleto, Nico Hülkenberg, I should say, or Jack Doohan, but I'm keeping Hadjar for that flexibility if I chose to move away from Oscar Piastri and Ferrari in the second race. Again, assuming I don't choose to activate Limitless in China, which is still a possibility. We will have to wait and see. But in 2 moves, given we have 2 transfers each week, I could get to McLaren and George Russell quite easily. Now, I know that leaves only 0.1 in the bank, and given that this team is probably subject to some degree of price changes, there will be a possibility I'm priced out of a move like this in the second race if I choose to go down that path. But that's probably the alternate team build I've got right now. Again, I said, there's flexibility for Doohan or Hülkenberg, for example. But right now, I just love this kind of flexibility to pivot between 2 different lineups. Now, I've talked a little bit about a budget building option as well, and I'll bring up my budget building team, or at least one of them, on the screen here. There's a couple of different ways you could go about building a budget or increasing your budget by going for more B-tier assets. And I still think you want to target some McLaren coverage. But as I talked about, you want to have reliable drivers that are consistent, that are navigating the DNF minefield. And I see Sainz, Hülkenberg, and Gasly as drivers that can do exactly that. Also, Bortoleto, as I said before, a driver that's made a name for himself, being consistent and reliable in the car by not putting it in the wall. And then Oscar Piastri, obviously, who completed every single lap last year. So I really like this in terms of reliability. And again, Hülkenberg, I'm not sure if I'd necessarily absolutely jump at, but you could also pivot around this lineup a little bit. If you could also go Williams, if you chose to go down that path. If not Gasly, you could go for Ocon, again another experienced driver that would give you enough for Fernando Alonso. If you didn't want to go Carlos Sainz, does Alex Albon cover off Sainz's fantasy production? I'm not so sure yet. But again, a lot is to be said for whether or not Williams is the 5th best car on the grid, or is that honour going to Alpine? I'm just not entirely sure, and we will need to see free practice to really discern that. But there is probably a path where, I could go down that budget building route. If I don't do it for my team 1, it will absolutely be a team 2 or team 3 option for me. So that's kind of where my head is at right now for my team selection, but I'm pretty confident my team will be very much based on, I'll just clear out the team here so you can see what I'm doing one last time, but it will be very much at this point in time, if the deadline was in 5 minutes, probably going with something like this. But again, stay tuned for my final thoughts in the deadline stream for more of an analysis of what my team could look like come Saturday. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my first team selection video for the season. As always, if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the channel and subscribe. Drop a like on the channel. I think I mean to say drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm already rambling and losing my head a bit. But as I said, I'll have a couple more videos going out this week. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all very soon.